It is LBC leading Britain's conversation. So this is part 3, I guess, our feature on Islam and the West. So firstly, we welcome Adam Dean. Adam is an Islamic scholastic theologian who dedicates his work to countering extremism and radical Islamist ideology, which he believes tarnishes the beauty of Islam. He regularly debates on issues surrounding extremism, religious philosophy and theology. He's also executive director at the Quilliam Foundation. Adam, nice to see you, sir.
Good evening.
This is everything I said in that introduction then when I was talking about, I guess you were sort of probably nodding your head there thinking you've heard all of these arguments that often come around, and they tend to gather new momentum after things like a terrorist attack.
Yeah. And because of these terrorist attacks, there's been a lot of focus on the Quran and, is the Quran or the ideas within the Quran responsible in some way for these acts? And the answer to that question is yes and no. It would be absurd to completely deny that these extremists, these terrorists, are actually using these verses. But I would also say that there is a particular type of reading and interpretation that lends itself to these kinds of acts being carried out. And one doesn't have to subscribe to those kind of understandings.
OK. We're also joined by Bill Warner from the United States. Bill is the founder and director for the Center for the Study of Political Islam. He's produced multiple books, regularly gives talks internationally about Islamic political doctrines. He has had a lifelong interest in religion and its effects on history. Has been studying the source texts of major religions for decades. Even before the destruction of the World Trade Center, he had predicted a war between Islam and America. Dr. Bill Warner, good evening to you, sir.
Hello.
So just tell me firstly, how does a physicist, because I think that's your day job, as it were, your background, suddenly get involved in battles between Islam and the West?
Well, I'm a 76-year-old man, and my interest in Islam started 46 years ago. When I was a mere youth of 30, and that seems young now, I became interested in Sufism. And so I went to hear talks by sheikhs, Pir Vilayat Khan, people like that. Went to Sufi dances, zikr, did a lot of reading. I was interested in Islam as a sort of mysticism that was more Western than, say, Hinduism. And then I lost my interest in that. And then later, my next round of learning Islam came as a college professor. I had many Muslim students, and there was something subtly different from them, from other foreign students. And I thought, well, I believe that religion shapes a person's character, so I started reading the Quran, this time cover to cover. And then when I finished that, I read the life of Muhammad. And so then my third round of study of Islam came on 9/11, September 11, 2001, when I realized I lived in a country that didn't know a Hindu from a Sikh from a Buddhist. And my approach is through basic laws, fundamental knowledge, and so I decided to make the doctrine of Islam clearly understandable to anybody who wanted to read it.
So fundamentally, you felt there was something different in the students that you were experiencing. In what respect? What was it that you? I mean, it sounds slightly odd, doesn't it? You thought they were a bit different to everybody else. I mean, were they different in what they were saying, or?
There was a subtle veil, and I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just more of a hunch, and so that. But like I say, I thought, well, as an example, I had students from, say, Nigeria, who were as foreign as, say, someone from Qatar, and yet they were Christian, and I didn't feel this subtle difference. Anyway, it was just a hunch, and so I started my reading the Quran, and then, like I say, the life of Muhammad, and suddenly things became pretty clear to me as to what the nature of Islam was.
Perhaps, Bill, you were the one with the problem.
Perhaps.
Yeah, it's just a thought. Maybe you were the one with the problem there.
Did you ever wonder that, Bill? Did you think, well, here's this book that's been around, predates anyone that you would be aware of? Clearly, did you look at it already with a kind of fairly? Was there an agenda when you first looked at it? Put it that way.
Well, I've studied this religious text all of my life as a child. I studied Orthodox. I studied, for instance, Torah at an Orthodox synagogue for a year and a half. I have an interest in religious works and how they shape character and ethics and history.
Okay, what were you setting it against then? What would you? I mean, did you set out to, clearly look in isolation just at the Quran? Were you doing a sort of comparable study? What was it that first kind of spiked you into that sort of endeavour? And were you setting out, did you sense in any way, to prove that Islam was bad or evil, or the Quran was in some way a doctrine of hate and poison?
Well, what I was interested in doing was making the book clearly so it could be understood by anyone else, and that was my first task. It struck me that it could be made more simple to read because when you study the history of the Quran, it was written roughly 2 decades after Muhammad's death, the one that we call the Quran now. And so it was arranged with the copy you get at the bookstore. It starts off with basically the longest chapter and goes to the shortest chapter. And so it didn't have a story in it. But anyway, I was interested in making this book understandable to anybody. It was sort of an intellectual challenge.
And I guess, Adam, you're not unfamiliar with people dissecting. It's what happens with history, religion, philosophy. People read scriptures, texts, they look at them from different perspectives. They try to find, if there are other stories behind them. I mean, what Bill was trying to do there isn't unusual in itself.
No, it's not unusual. I think that any religious text should be approached in an objective manner to really understand the message and to put aside any kind of political agenda or any kind of biases. I think that's honourable, and I think it's very, very academic. I mean, out of curiosity, I would ask Bill, is he committed to any particular religion, for example, Christianity?
I have no religion.
You're not committed to. You wouldn't consider yourself a Christian.
I have no religion.
No religion. Okay. I mean, my question to Bill would be, why would he emphasize so much on Islam or the Quran as being violent? I mean, there are violent passages within the text, and not have the same standards applied to, for example, the Old Testament.
Well, I don't do comparative religion. I simply wanted to make the book, the Quran, understandable, as well as the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and the Hadith.
Yeah. I think what my point was, sorry, I didn't express myself properly. The way in which you speak about Islam is that you describe it as inherently problematic and inherently violent and hostile, but you don't seem to have that same kind of reservation with other texts like the Old Testament, where there are probably more violent passages and more graphic passages pertaining to rape and war and pillaging. I guess, yes, you have every right to sort of talk about Islam and focus on that as part of your work, but the fact that you present Islam as this inherently evil thing, and you wouldn't perhaps do it with any other religion, or maybe you would.
First off, I'm not interested in the religion of Islam, that is, the part that goes to heaven and avoids hell. I'm interested in how Islam treats the non-Muslim, the kafir. That's my primary interest.
Yeah, I've noticed, Bill, looking at some of your the kind of your YouTube work, your online work, that does seem to be an area specifically of fascination about how you claim the Quran treats or speaks about non-believers. What is your contention there, sir?
Well, first off, I was struck when I read the Quran how much of it was devoted to the non-believer, the kafir. And so this was the first thing that intrigued me about it, and the more I read it, the more I realized that the book was very strange to understand. It was contradictory. And so I was interested in finding out how could the book be made understandable. And so the first thing I decided to do was to put it in the right time order. This is well known, and all of a sudden the book becomes very different because there's a story within the Quran. Let's summarize Muhammad's life, and it'll summarize the Quran as well. Muhammad preached the religion of Islam for 13 years in Mecca and persuaded 150 Arabs to become Muslims. He then went to Medina, where he became a politician and a jihadist. He engaged in some 95 acts of jihad in the last 9 years of his life, and when he died, every Arab in the Arab, what we call the Arabia today, was a Muslim. So we have here two different persons. We have a preacher who preached the religion of peace in Mecca, and we have a politician who practiced jihad in Medina. And so this causes the confusion because Mecca and Medina are quite different when you read them.
Adam, is that in itself? Do you see where Bill's coming from on that? Is there a contradiction here?
I mean, I see what Bill's saying, but I'm not really that impressed by it. Actually, it's this kind of splitting of the Quranic text and this kind of Makkah and Medina sort of idea is quite simplistic and almost sort of juvenile. To be fair,
but is he wrong?
To be fair, he's not sort of a Quranic scholar or an expert. He's a physicist, but I can understand why he would make that mistake. What he's trying to imply here is that the Quran, when it's in the Makkah stage, where Prophet Muhammad was a minority, was peaceful, and then when he obtained power in Medina, he became violent and started to kill everybody. That's what's being implied here. But that idea is just completely false. If we're even charitable, we could say it's a particular interpretation of the Quranic text. And this is where sort of Bill has a difficulty, because what he argues is premised on the idea that Islam is monolithic, that there is only one way of interpreting it, one way of understanding the Quranic texts. And I guess that's his biggest flaw in his entire presentation and his works. And I think that is quite a big stumbling block for him to sort of argue his point.
Is that the problem, Bill? Do you recognise that analysis of your own study from Adam Dean?
Well, first off, I would say Islam is the doctrine found in the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad. That's what I would define Islam as. Now, that gives us 3 books, Quran, Sirah, and Hadith. Now, how those are, quote, interpreted is another issue. I, for instance, interpret them from the standpoint of what happens to the kafir, the non-believer. For the Muslim,
who is the non-believer, Bill? Who is the what is the definition of kafir according to the classical scholars?
Well, let me ask you a question, sir.
Well, I just asked you a question. If you could politely answer my question, then you can probably ask me one later. But what's the classical understanding of a kafir in the Quran? Because you keep using these words, and I think if we're going to be academic and objective, I think we need to sort of define them. So what do you mean by kafir? And the Arabic word that it's derived from comes from the word kafara, which I'm not going to tell you quite right now what that means, but because that will help you too much. But what does the word kafir actually mean according to the classical understanding?
The classical, to go back to the root KFR, I believe that means to hide or conceal, to cover.
Correct,
sir.
So how did the classical scholars understand that term?
Well, the way I understand it, I'm not a classical scholar, the way I understand it is it's a person who, like myself, believes that Muhammad was not the prophet of Allah.
Yeah.
The Quran is a derivative work.
No, actually that's incorrect, because non-belief doesn't constitute kufr. What constitutes kufr, or to be a kafir, is someone who believes Islam is true and conceals it and is hostile towards it. So you, for example, I wouldn't consider you a kafir, Ian a kafir. Most people in the world are not considered to be kafir according to this definition. So
whereas somebody who is a Muslim, perhaps, who had studied Quranic education and they know what everything is about, but then refuses to acknowledge it, they would be a kafir.
Yeah, someone who actively believes that Islam is actually true religion, that Muhammad was a messenger, and actually says, well, no, I'm not going to follow it. I'm not going to believe in it. And on top of that, actually is hostile and aggressive towards it. That's the actual definition of a kafir, coming from the word kafra, which means to conceal, as Bill mentioned. But the way he uses these terms are completely inaccurate. He says anyone who doesn't believe in Islam is a kafir. That's incorrect.
Bill, stay where you are, sir. We'll be back with some more in a second. We have Dr. Bill Warner, Adam Dean with us. We're debating that aspect. And whatever questions, by the way, you want to throw up on this, our lines are open, 0345 6060 973. I mentioned at the beginning how often this issue comes up, that people talk about the Quran says this, it says that, and it's a directory of evil, and Muslims are allowed to lie to you, and even when you challenge them on that, they're allowed to lie because the Quran says they can. All of the above that you will be familiar with. How much of that is true? What is the fact from the fiction, the truth on this one? If you've got a question you want to put either to Dr. Bill Warner or to Adam Dean, 0345 6060 973.
Late Nights with Ian Collins on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We are talking the Quran. This is the third part of our series of the Western Islam, focusing in specifically on the Quran because it comes up so often, particularly after terror attacks. And as I said before the break, lots of accusations that it's just full of instructions to Muslims to hate, and clearly holy jihad, subjugation of everywhere in the name of Islam, etc. I mean, how much is any of that true? Firstly, Adam Dean. Adam is an Islamic scholastic theologian, dedicated to really countering extremism, radical Islamist ideology. I mean, when you hear people say, well, hang on, it's the good book in your world, like a Christian sees theirs and the Jews see the Torah, etc., surely everyone wants to think their book is an instruction to get as many people as possible involved.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a negative thing to want to convince people of what you think is to be correct and right, and in religion it's no different. You know, if someone believes that their religion is correct and it's divine and they want other people to be saved, let's say, it's quite normal to try and proselytize that news. Where it becomes a problem is when you want to coerce people, when you want to actually take your ideas and force people to accept them and take means such as violence. That's where it becomes a problem. Now the question is, you know, does the Quran encourage this? And again, it depends on the type of interpretation you hold to. If you hold to a kind of atomistic understanding where you pluck a verse out or completely out of a context and say, oh look, there's a verse here that says go and kill the kuffar, and have a misunderstanding of the word kuffar as Bill just did, and other sort of anti-Muslim bigots, if you were, then you're going to take violence and use it as a means to propagate your religion. But if you understand the whole social vision of the Quran, where it mentions justice over 50 times throughout the entire text, then you're not going to do that.
Let me bring Dr. Bill Warner back in, because you may want to come back, Bill, just before we went to the break there, on the point that Adam was making about your perhaps differing views on kafir and the interpretation of it, and Adam suggesting that it perhaps means something completely different to how you were seeing it. What are your thoughts to that?
Adam seems to love to use the word interpretation, but when I give my interpretation, he says, oh no, Bill, your interpretation is wrong. As a non-believer, you don't have the right to interpret, and what you say is mistaken. I'd ask him a question. Since he deals with extremism, is Islamic State an extremist organization? Is it even Islamic?
Well, firstly, I didn't say that you don't have an interpretation. In fact, I would say that it's actually what I would say, if we understand ISIS, the way that ISIS understand the religion, I would say it's valid but not sound, if I was charitable. I think my point to you was that you don't recognize interpretations. You don't recognize positive interpretations of the Quran, humanistic interpretations, rational, ethical interpretations. The only interpretation you think is valid and only exists is the one that you propagate, that Islam is inherently violent and evil and wants to convert the whole world and subjugate non-Muslims. That's the view that you think is Islam. And I can't believe you just asked me, is the Islamic State an extremist? I think you need to have a look at my work.
I'll just ask you a simple question. I've never seen your work.
Well,
is Islamic State an extremist organization?
Well, given the fact that I was introduced as working for a counter-extremist organisation, it's a bit of a bizarre question, but yeah.
So what is it? What are you saying then, Bill? In that question, I mean, Islamic State clearly is an extremist organisation. I have a feeling that Adam isn't about to dispute that either. What's the subtext of what you're driving at here?
Because I don't consider them to be extremist.
So you don't think they're extreme? You think they are?
No.
Okay.
See, that's my point. That's exactly my point. Because what Bill, his whole message is that there is no interpretation of the Quranic text, and that ISIS sorry, just 1 second, and that ISIS are actually the true interpreters of the Islamic faith. That's just bizarre, absolutely bizarre. He has no reason to support that. The only reason that he would support that is because he wants to believe it to begin with, because it suits his agenda, whatever that may be. I mean, I have a sneaky suspicion, but let's put that aside. If you look at the text in its entirety, you will find that there is a social vision that is contradictory to what ISIS want to implement. One of the challenge I've heard Bill speak before in one of his interviews. He says that he likes to take all the facts and all the details. Well, in actual fact, his interpretation of the Islamic faith doesn't take all the facts. It doesn't take all the verses that are talking about justice, that are talking about, if you like, a just war theory. I mean, I have a very strong belief that if we look at just war theory, where the West's understanding of just war theory, it actually overlaps with the Quranic injunctions for war. So, for example, we look at the two aspects of just war theory. So you have jus ad bellum, which is the conditions to enter into war. The conditions there that the cause must be just, that the justice of the cause is sufficiently great as to warrant warfare and does not negate countervailing values. Warfare is genuinely the last resort. So it's war is seen as a necessary evil according to just war theory. And then you have the conditions within war, jus in bello. So it says that you should have discrimination in the selection of targets, proportionality. Now, if we look at the Quran and if we look at the actual text, they support those conditions. Lo and behold. For example, Surah 39:40 says, those who have been attacked... Sorry, excuse me, just 1 second. Those who have been attacked are permitted to take up arms because they have been wronged. God has the power to help them. Those who have been driven unjustly from their homes only for saying our Lord is God. If God did not repel some people by means of others, many monasteries, churches and synagogues and mosques where God's names much involved would have been destroyed. So it's saying that people that are oppressed, that are under attack, are allowed to engage in warfare.
Okay, let's bring Bill back in. Bill, what did you want to say to that?
Well, I was just curious. He's talking about timing. And when you read the life of Muhammad, the Sirah, we find that Muhammad attacked every single neighbor he had. So I guess every single neighbor that he had did not meet the criteria for living in harmony with Islam.
So, firstly, Bill, you don't know the difference between Sirah and Sunnah. Sirah
is the life of Muhammad, spelled S-I-R-A. Sunnah is his actions.
No, actually, it's not.
Actually, it is.
No, it's not. Sunnah falls into three areas within Islamic jurisprudence in the science of hadith, where it's relevant to jurisprudence. It's firstly his sayings, his consent, and his actions. Sirah is his biography that were collected many years ago, which don't have the same scrutiny in authenticity as hadith. And in fact, Sirah is never used as a form of jurisprudence and also in theology.
Actually, Sirah is used because you need to do abrogation, and abrogation depends upon knowing whether it happened earlier or later, and that can only be found from the life of Muhammad.
Why is abrogation relevant to this discussion right now?
Because unless you understand abrogation, I don't see how you can understand the Quran.
No, you explain to me what you mean by abrogation, because I'm just a bit bewildered why you just brought that into the conversation.
You said the Sirah played no part in the understanding of Islam.
No, I said in terms of jurisprudence and in theology, it does not play a role. What plays a role is hadith, because the scrutiny of hadith is much higher.
The Quran has no time in it, correct? When I read the Quran, it's not a story. When I read the Hadith, they're not a story. So if we're going to introduce time or progression into the Quran to understand whether abrogation, that is a verse, abrogate an earlier verse, we have to know what's earlier and what's later, and that only comes from the Sirah.
Gents, let's just leave it there for 1 second. We're going to come back in a moment. We've got lots of questions as well to put to either Bill or Adam or both. 0345 6060 973. Our lines are open. Before we continue, let's get some news headlines from Oliver Jones.
Ian Collins on LBC.
We're talking the Quran, and the reason is rather simple, as I outlined at the beginning. This is part of our series of programmes on Islam and the West, and we talk often. I was picked up on this point by Sue, who said, the wonderfully politically correct Ian Collins talks about Islam but must shoehorn in Christianity. Well, I didn't, to be honest, Sue. I talked about the fact that the Bible and the Quran certainly are often held up there as having passages instructing death and destruction on all manner of people. I cited the website about the Bible that does precisely that. However, the reason we're doing this discussion at length is because by a country mile, it's the Quran that comes up, particularly after terror attacks or there's been an incident of some kind. Various interpretations, and who knows whether those that will post online or opine on phone-in programmes are coming from good place or bad, but certainly we know that the Quran finds itself right in the centre of the headline. So the biblical comparison, I hope, was journalistically reasonable in that context. Let's take a question. We have Dr. Bill Warner with us. Bill, founder and director of the Centre for the Study of Political Islam. He's produced multiple books, regularly gives talks internationally about Islamic political doctrines, lifelong interest in religion and its effects on history, and been studying texts for decades. Adam DEEN is with us, Islamic scholastic theologian, dedicated his work to countering extremism and radical Islamist ideology, which he believes tarnishes, and I quote, the beauty of Islam. We have a question. Sam, first of all, in Liverpool. Sam, hello.
Hi there, Ian.
Hi. What would you like to say?
Well, I had a couple of points and then a brief question.
Yeah.
But my first point being that I assume, as well as I can lump in most of the listeners here, that I'm far less qualified to talk about this than the two gentlemen we have on. It's been a very interesting discussion, but I think part of this discussion is that tonight we've heard a very interesting debate, but this really goes above the heads over a lot of people that are listening. So when you were talking just before the break about the two words and their sort of their meanings, for most people that goes over the head. And I would be interested in making the point that perhaps for these extremists, they miss a lot of the point in the inner workings of the Quran. But I had another point, which was that the original intention of this book, as well as any religious book, as well-meaning as it can be, it's about the interpretation of it nowadays. And I had a question actually for Adam, because he would probably know more about this than I would. A lot of this interpretation, I hear about Wahhabism, the extremism that comes from that, and about edited verses of the Quran in Wahhabism. And maybe these are two heads clashing because there's basically a different text that has been given to people to encourage extremism, to encourage radicalism. So I'd like to ask Adam, what link that would have to it, and that alteration in the literature of the Quran would have in extremism.
You raised some good points there, Sam, and there is a big problem in the way that we translate the Quran. I mean, there are some sort of Saudi-funded translations of the Quran are atrocious. I mean, some of the English in there, the English translations, and some of the things that they add in there, it's just terrible. And that adds
to these copies that are out there in madrasas being taught in this country? Yeah,
the majority of the free Qurans that are distributed are Saudi translations. And they're the ones that are the problem. So they'll add bits in there to, let's say, subjugate women, to control women, about sort of more negative connotations against Christians. They'll say things like, if the Quran talks about idle chit-chat, they'll say that includes listening to music, for example. They want to ban music. All of this sort of stuff is sort of contributes to the problem. So you've got that problem, and then you've also got the added problem where you've got these, what I would call sort of puritanical interpretations. And one form of that is Wahhabism, where what they do is they take the verse that was applied to 7th century and abruptly want to implement that in the 21st century, which is absurd because the social reality, the historical reality doesn't exist. Therefore, it becomes
so there's a contextual element.
Absolutely, yeah. So, look, context is extremely important, right, to our lives. Suppose you're now walking past a room and you hear the agony screaming of an individual, screaming in agony, screaming and shouting, "This man's going to kill me, this man's going to kill me." You barge into the room, and then what you discover is a doctor who's holding down a patient who has gangrene on his leg and he needs to amputate it because he will die. That context completely changes the moral and ethical framework.
Let me bring in Bill Warner. Bill, I want to give you some time on this, sir. I mean, it isn't context the issue, and is that, despite the many decades of work that you've been doing, do you think it's possible that maybe the point that Adam makes, and despite your what appear to be some disagreement here, is that not reasonable? That context is crucial to this, and you're missing that?
I absolutely agree that context is critical. That's the reason when I read the Quran, I read the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, along with it, because we can see that once we do that, the Quran begins to make sense. Instead of randomly choosing verses and quoting them one at a time, I do approach the interpretation of the Quran systemically. And that is, I include what Muhammad was doing at the time the verse was revealed, because this allows us to see the progression of the story in the Quran. As I said, the Quran starts off as a hymn to God and ends with political domination of the world. It's an epic story once you put it in the right time order.
But Prophet Muhammad didn't dominate the world, so then how can you say that you're following the Sirah?
He dominated the world that was around him. As I mentioned earlier, you never spoke to this issue. If he had a neighbor, he attacked them.
No, in actual fact, the neighbors attacked him, and therefore he retaliated.
So the battle at Mu'tah, for instance, where he had to leave and go to Syria,
How about the Battle of Badr?
The Battle of Badr, that one they did come to him, but why did they come to him? Because previously they'd managed 8 raids against the Meccan caravan.
Why did they raid the caravans? Because they were raiding the caravans because they had their belongings. Because when they left Makkah, they were not allowed to take their belongings. And when they found out they were carrying their belongings, they raided the caravans to take back what belongs to them. What's wrong with that?
But is that... Go on, Bill, you carry on, sorry.
In the previous raids...
Bill, I think.
Just Adam, can we let's just hear Bill out on this point, and then I'll come back to Adam. Bill,
let's take Muhammad's life in Medina, where there were 3 tribes of Jews. When he moved there, it was half Jewish, but 2 years to 3 years later, was no Jews were alive. Did those Jews attack Muhammad? Did they steal his stuff? I think not. He took.
No, they conspired against him when they had a treaty, where they had the peace treaty. The 3 tribes. The first time they broke the treaty, they were not killed. The second time they broke the treaty, they were not killed. The third time, when they conspired with the Quraysh that would have slaughtered the entire Muslim population, they did actually try them, and they actually killed the Jews that conspired against them. But they did not kill the people, the individuals that were not involved in that conspiracy.
That Muhammad did the right thing when he killed the 800 Jews and then put the women and children up for slaves?
Bill, what you don't understand is these are what's called historical accounts, which are apocryphal at best.
Historical.
They're apocryphal. There are accounts which people and scholars dispute they happened. It is not theology. It is not Quran. But and this is what I'm trying to get you to understand.
The life of Muhammad is of no import.
No, the life of Muhammad is not a source of legislation. It is not a source of theology. The Quran...
It is a source of understanding.
No, the Quran... This is like your linchpin, because once you lose that, your entire argument against Islam being this inherently violent religion and hostile to non-Muslims
falls apart. Actually, I don't hold
it's
inherently violent. I hold it's dualistic and has a peaceful side and a jihad side.
So it can be interpreted to be peaceful.
When I interpret it, when I take the Quran written in Mecca, since you want to stay with the Quran and not the Sirah, I find that all the Meccan verses, there's no jihad included. But when we go to Medina and read the Medinan verses and surah and chapters, then we have 24% of them are devoted to jihad.
Bill, are you aware that the Quran is not in chronological order?
I think I said that earlier when I started off.
So you are aware it's not in chronological order?
I'm absolutely aware of that.
Great. Are you aware that there's no consensus on which verses are from Medina and which verses are from Mecca? We don't actually know as a consensus which, and there's a massive scholarly debate in circles about which verses are actually in Medina. Some say some verses are in Mecca, and they say, no, actually that one's in Medina. So how can you even construct an argument when we don't even know which verses are in Medina and which verses are in Mecca?
Well, let me ask you this. Since you don't know which is Mecca, which is Medina, how do you handle abrogation when verses in the Quran contradict each other?
Abrogation isn't a problem for me. That's something that you just invented. It's not part of the Islamic faith.
Don't insult me.
Well, I mean, why? I mean, part of my religion is not abrogation. I don't know where you're getting this from. I mean, it's fanciful. I mean, where are you getting this idea of abrogation? It's not, there's not the Holy Trinity, like the Quran, Sunnah, and abrogation. As far as I'm aware, Islam is built upon the Quran and the Sunnah. I mean, I don't understand what this. Well, great, you agree with me, but then please elaborate why you're so obsessed with this thing called abrogation.
Well, in fact, let's come back to that in a second. We've got lots of other questions we want to get on as well. We just pause momentarily. Dr. Bill Warner is with us. Adam Dean with us too. 0345 6060 973. It's Late Nights with Ian Collins, LBC.
Late Nights with Ian Collins on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We're certainly dividing the room on this one, that's for sure. I'll talk to Adam in Edgware in a second. We have Adam Dean with us in the studio. Bill Warner joins us from the United States. And Bill, just clear up, if you would, this area that appears to be a bit of a sticking point between you two here. The point that you would wish to counter from where Adam last spoke.
Well, first off, Adam's rules of the game are very serious, very easy. He's an Islamic scholar. He understands Islam. The Saudis don't understand it, but he does. And he wants to talk about interpretation, but he doesn't allow any room for anyone else's interpretation. For instance, studying Islam, I would say if I were going to be a Muslim, I would be a Wahhabi, because I disagree with Adam. I don't think they're extremists, nor do I think Islamic State is extreme, because when I read Islamic State, it's very fascinating. They lay out the Sunnah of Muhammad to justify everything that they do, including sex slaves.
Even though Wahhabism was a product of the 18th century.
And your product, when did it come about, Adam?
No, you're saying that you would be a Wahhabi, but Wahhabism was a product of the 18th century with Ibn Abdul Wahhab.
And your form of Islam, what is it a product of?
Well, my form of Islam is a product of the Quran and the Sunnah.
My Islam is also a product of the Quran and the Sunnah.
So therefore you accept interpretation then?
Of course I do. I'm giving you my interpretation, but you tell me that mine and the Wahhabis and all others in Islamic states are not right.
Am I right?
I can argue that they're incorrect, but my whole contention with you, Bill, is that you argue that their interpretation is the interpretation. I
say it matches the Quran and the Sunnah. That's what I say.
But isn't
there seem to be many correct answers. You seem to advance the idea
Bill,
that there's only one form of Islam that's true, and that's Adam's.
Bill, overarchingly, are you saying, Bill, because you're talking about Wahhabism and ISIS as that being sort of pure Islam? I guess the overarching headline of that.
I would say they're pure Islam. I would say they're acceptable Islam.
Okay, so is your contention then that Islam is a violent religion?
I didn't say that. I said it.
No, I'm asking, is that your contention?
It contains violence, yes.
So it's not a violent... See, this is what I'm finding very difficult, you, Bill, because I've watched your videos, and often, you start by saying Islam is X, Y, and Z. Islam wants to subjugate the non-Muslims. But here now, talking to us on LBC, now you're saying, well, it's an interpretation. It's a form of, let's say, Wahhabism. It's an acceptable interpretation that you think.
But Adam, who are then all of those other Muslims that, few in number or not, the ISIS, the Wahhabi purveyors of Wahhabism, that lot, to put it in inverted commas, that Bill is referring to, those that are interpreting Islam in a way that will throw gay men off buildings, set fire to women, drown people, torture, the sort of images we're used to seeing. Who are that lot? Because they shout God is great when they kill people.
No, absolutely. I mean, they subscribe to a particular reading, as we've discussed. It's Wahhabism. I mean, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Boko Haram, they all subscribe to this Wahhabism, which is extremely hostile. It divides the world into Muslim and Kafir, as Bill was doing earlier. So Bill could actually take up a job as, ISIS spokesman, given the kind of stuff that he was saying earlier, if maths doesn't work out for him. But they're extremely hostile to the West and view the West as being antithetical to Islam. And Wahhabism was a product of the 18th century. There's a chap called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who basically said that everybody else was a kafir, and pitted himself against the whole entire Muslims and started killing Muslims that were rationalists and mystical Muslims and Shia Muslims. He started killing everybody. Bill,
when you talked, and I will talk to another Adam in a second, Adam in Edgware. Bill, when you mentioned at the very beginning, and I know a lot of your work outlines, robustly that it's the treatment of the non-believer that is sort of your prime area of fascination. Are you accepting of Adam's point that wouldn't be an interpretation that would represent all of Islam, even if it's something that represents a small part of it in organisations like ISIS?
First off, we need to make a clear distinction between Muslims and who can do what they wish, and then we have the doctrine of Islam, which is Quran and Sunnah. I don't think that the Quran and Sunnah that's sort of like a rock. Everyone must use it, but Islam itself doesn't change. It is Quran and Sunnah.
But I find that extremely difficult. I mean, it's very, very simplistic what you're saying. I mean,
but is it more complicated than that? Do you agree that Islam is the doctrine found in the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad? Yes or no? Easy.
Yes. I mean, earlier I said I follow the Quran and Sunnah, but how I understand the Quran, in what kind of methodology do I
understand it from the standpoint of those who are abused when jihad occurs. That's how I understand it.
So what do you mean? Sorry, I didn't understand that.
I have you live in a world, Adam, in which your world is very smooth and fine, and you are correct, and everyone else is wrong.
Well, don't you think that you're right? Don't you think you're correct, and the people that oppose your view are wrong as well? That would be a bit silly.
I don't claim to be right. I claim to have an interpretation.
Which is right, according to you?
It's right according to me, yes.
Right. Okay. So it's not very different from my standpoint then.
Gents, let me just bring in. I just want to get in another question before we run out of time. This is another Adam, but in Edgware. Adam, good evening to you.
Good evening. How are you?
Very well, sir. What would you like to say?
Well, first of all, hello to Bill and Adam. Thanks very much for allowing me to come on. Look, from my point of view, I think you're missing the point, both of you. That's my point of view. It's less of a question, more of a statement. My point is that the Quran or Islam is effectively, what's the story? The story is about God. I come from a background where half my family are Catholic, so obviously I had, essentially religions from 15 viewpoints from both religions. And when I read the Quran in Arabic and also in English, what I find amazing and beautiful about the Quran is that its central theme is all about God.
Yeah.
It's a continuation of Christianity, continuation of Judaism, continuation of whatever.
Yes.
So, and also the thing is the problem with both of them, unfortunately, they're just treating the Islam and everything else as some sort of political ideology or some kind of system or code of government.
Okay, well, let me put that to Bill Warner then first. Sorry to cut in, Adam, on that point. Bill, do you think when you interpret religions, and in this case Islam, you're kind of talking about it as some sort of political dogma, as distinct from the beauty that religion, and in this case Islam, is referring to?
I've tried to be very clear. I have no interest in the religion of Islam, that is the practices which lead to going to paradise and avoiding hell. I have no interest in that subject at all. What I'm interested in is how Islam treats the non-Muslim. That's my entire interest.
How does Islam treat the non-Muslims?
Well, let's go back to Muhammad.
No. Please refer to the Quran.
I'm referring to Muhammad because That's what
We don't need to refer to the
You want
Sirah.
to keep the whole discussion on the Quran, and what I want to do is move it to Muhammad.
Well, the actual discussion this evening was the Quran, Bill. Sorry, it was the Quran. That's why we're talking about the Quran.
Say again?
Tonight's discussion was about the Quran, and that's why we're talking about it.
That.
Well,
I was not informed about that. I thought it was about Islam.
Well, okay, let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt here. It's a wide brief in that respect. Bill, do continue the point you wanted to make. We've only got about 10 seconds, though, sir.
I'm interested in the part of Islam that deals with the kafir, the non-believer. The religious part is of no interest to me at all.
So, and your belief is that Islam, as kind of a wholesale position, is disparaging, disrespectful, and dismissive of the non-believer.
I find that to be
Okay, Adam. Just a final point. Why is that not true?
Well, I mean, it can be an
Do you hate Bill because you're a Muslim?
No, I don't hate Bill. I think Bill's, someone who needs a bit of love, perhaps. But Bill, I mean, sincerely, I would advise you to probably stick to physics. I know this sort of stuff sells books, but really, you really need to stick to what you're good at.
Say again, Bill?
I said Adam is quite condescending.
Well, I mean, you're condescending. You're quite condescending about the belief of like 1.5 billion people. So,
I told you I don't care about the 1.5 billion's belief. I care how I'm treated by those who do believe.
Okay, on that point, Bill Warner, thank you, sir. Great to have you on. Adam Dean, thank you, Adam. Nice to see you. It's Late Nights with Ian Collins, LBC.
On FM, online, on your mobile, and on digital radio. Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.